Hi, everybody, and welcome to 32Soft's much anticipated June webinar. I'm Denise, your host, and with me today to present is the magnificent Don Lindsey, to whom I will hand off in just a moment. As soon as today's replay from the session is available, I will follow up with our encore email, which will include a link to the replay, all of today's questions and answers. And this month we will also include fresh off the press MRP articles too. More on that shortly. But we do typically get out the encore within a few days. And finally, it is with great enthusiasm I get to introduce MRP and QAD guru Don Lindsey as our first-time presenter. And for those of you who don't know yet, Don, he is a knowledgeable consultant, project manager, business analyst, and functionality trainer for all areas of QAD. His experience includes several large, complex QAD ERP projects, and Don has spent significant time dedicated to manufacturing systems management, service, support, and finance. His diverse background includes a wide variety of manufacturing industries, including medical, electronics, industrial, consumer products. In addition to QAD Explore and QAD Regional User Group conferences, Don has spoken for many years at the Apex conferences. He also taught at the Apex certification program at California State Fullerton for over 20 years. Let me also add that having recently celebrated his 50th wedding anniversary, Don is a family man and an all-around good guy.
Welcome to our webinar on MRP. Historically, I've found that the use of MRP, specifically in QAD, but in general, has been less than optimal. So what we hope to do today is to cover a couple of subjects, talk about ERP and the fact that MRP is the backbone of all ERP systems. Talk a little bit about forecasting, look at reorder point and what that means in terms of ERP or your MRP system. Talk about safety stock, look at EOQ, and then in July, we'll come back with another webinar on the mechanics of MRP, netting, planned orders, etc. So, a little bit of history of ERP. ERP started back in the 1960s when IBM created a application that ran on a mainframe called the BOMP, the Bill of Material Processor. Some gentlemen, Ollie White, George Plossel, several others, took that bill of material processor, which represented the structure of a product inside the computer, and developed a time phase planning tool called material requirements planning. Then in the 1960s and 1970s, MRP was developed into a pretty stable application, a software application, that allowed this time phase planning of the bill of material across a time fence. Then as we progressed into the 1990s, the dear people at Gardner came up with a term called MRP2. MRP2 morphed into the application of ERP, and now we find ourselves with a plethora of ERP systems, Oracle, Infor, Epicor, QAD, that are referred to as ERP. And not only do they have the material requirements planning process, but they've also got other applications such as manufacturing execution systems, transportation systems, et cetera, et cetera. So this is a picture of ERP2. It starts up with business planning and feeds down into sales and operations planning. Sales operations planning sends down into master production scheduling. then master production scheduling feeds down into requirements planning, and then down into shop floor control. So up at the top is this thing called SIOP, and then for the next two webinars, we're going to concentrate primarily on this mature requirements planning process. Sales and operations planning is a tool where the heads of R&D, finance, operations, sales get together on a monthly basis and reconcile what did we sell last month, what did we forecast last month, what did we actually produce, and this becomes basically the heart of ERP. If you don't have a sales and operations planning process, the use of any ERP system to adequately plan is going to be negatively impacted. So ERP, the SIOP process, really is what makes MRP work. The benefits of ERP are manifest. It improves customer service. It improves inventory management. It gives the plant the opportunity to operate efficiently. Improves planning capabilities, which I'm sure a lot of us are planners and buyers, and it also helps in supplier performance. Basically, the ERP system enforces a formal planning system. One of the things that annoys me more than any is when I see organizations using spreadsheets to plan their system. The ERP system is the formal planning system, and that's what needs to be driven by this SIOP process. There's two concepts in this idea of demand. The first is what is called independent demand. Independent demand is basically demand that is at the whim of the customer. It's independent of other sources. This is what needs to be forecast. Demand must be forecast, and we'll talk a little bit about safety stock to cover demand fluctuations. The other is dependent demand. Dependent demand is demand that is calculated primarily from the source of demand for something else. In ERP's mode, it's the parent item. So there are specific techniques for each type of demand. We use specific techniques for independent demand. We use specific techniques for dependent demand. And there are many parts which have both types of demand. So, forecasting. What do we do with forecasting? Forecasting drives MRP. Through the master production schedule, and regrettably we don't have time to talk about master production scheduling as much as I'd like to, but it's the estimate of future demand. Typically a mathematical calculation based on historical demand, the use of subjective estimates for informal processes, that's the independent demand. And as I said, some parts actually have a combination of two. It's the objective projection of demand modified by subjective knowledge. As I said, the only major causes of forecasts are the people who make forecasts and the people who use it. So you've got to understand forecasts and know what you're doing. The forecasting methods are, number one, qualitative. Qualitative is basically based on intuition, tends to be subjective. So you have to think about it instead of actually calculating. And such things as panel consensus, Delphi, market research, historical analyze, and I'm sure a lot of us have this qualitative forecasting technique called, what does the CEO want to do? The other type of forecasting is quantitative, and this is based on historical usage, historical calculations of data. And it assumes the future will repeat in the past. Combination of the two, the qualitative and the quantitative, then become the company forecast. So in terms of QAD, this is where you use 22.1 forecast maintenance to input the values into your MRP system. Principles of forecasting are, number one, they're never right. Number two, they're always accurate in large groups of items than in single items. That's why we do business planning, production planning, master scheduling, and MRP, because we can more readily forecast large groups instead of individuals. We assume that the future in the near future is more accurate than the far distant future, and they should include an error method. We'll talk about this when we talk about safety stock. Methods should be used before being adopted. You can't just start using a forecasting method and then change your mind and figure that it's going to work. You got to test what those are. And forecasts are not a substitute for calculated demand. As we saw dependent demand, we need to forecast, or actually calculate from demand of a parent. So you don't forecast dependent demand. All actual forecasts are actually consumed by orders, and there's a field in QED that we can use to do that. And you need to track and measure as frequently as required. And this as required typically gets ignored. It should be at least monthly. I see a lot of organizations only tracking and measuring forecasts on either a quarterly, sometimes a semi-annually, and God forbid an annual representation. The goal for forecasting is not to make forecasts right, it's to make forecasts less wrong, more accurate. There's a number of forecasting techniques. The statistical techniques are average, moving average, weighted moving average, and exponential smoothing. Basically, what an average is a forecast. It's a straight line projection of what you expect to sell. The exponential smoothing formula, which is typically your most used forecasting technique, takes the new forecast or calculates the new forecast equal to an alpha factor, and regrettably we don't have enough time to talk about forecasting. We're planning another webinar on forecasting later in the year, times 1 minus that alpha times the old forecast. So that can give us double exponential smoothing, triple smoothing, and then if you want to get into the more complex mathematical techniques of regression analysis, neural networks, Holt-Winters methods, you can do that. But basically what you're doing is you're calculating an average and you're inputting that average as a forecast modified by subjective knowledge. So what about reorder point? I see a lot of organizations using reorder point as their method of planning when to release the next order into either the shop or the purchase area. Reorder point is based upon a target level, and we'll talk about this demand through lead time plus safety stock, where the target level is equal to the demand per period, and that demand can either be historical demand, or you can actually go into MRP_DEEC and calculate the actual projected demand from MRP. You then multiply or add the review period and the lead time times that demand and add safety stock, and that will then give you your target level. So what you have on hand minus the target level is typically what you're going to order. Now this reorder point, if we look at it in terms of this graph, we can see that you consume product over time, in this case 5 periods of time, and then the logic is that you replenish inventory with an order quantity and repeat the cycle. The curve that represents the demand is basically small incremental decreases in inventory. We'll talk about safety stock, but we normally maintain safety stock because this curve sometimes goes this way, sometimes goes this way. So the safety stock is our calculation against the fluctuations in demand. And then we order an EOQ, and based on lead time, when the quantity reaches this reorder point, we launch an order out into the system. So if we look at some values, if we started off with 100 units and we have 20 units of safety stock with a 2-period lead time, we can see that the reorder point, that point at which we would launch a new order, is equal to 100 minus 20 equals 80 divided by the 5 periods of consumption. Means we're going to consume 16 units per period. So the demand through lead time is 16 times 2, or 32. And so therefore, the safety stock is the reorder, or the demand through lead time plus safety stock, or 52 units. So when the inventory reaches that 52 point, we launch an order out into the system. Here's a simple reorder calculation. We've got 200 units per week, 200 units of safety stock, order quantity of 2,000, and a 4-week lead time. So you can see that you could very easily create a spreadsheet that has all these parameters and automatically calculate the reorder point for each independent demand item. Here's some reorder point concepts. The order quantities are usually fixed in order where that EOQ, or that lot size, is normally the same. Reorder point is determined by the average demand through lead time. So if you're going to use reorder points, you need to recalculate demand every single month or every single period. The intervals between replenishment are typically not constant because that demand curve that we saw on the sawtooth curve is not necessarily constant and consistent. The average inventory is equal to the order quantity minus 2 average plus safety stock. So reorder point is fine at that top level, at the independent demand level. It works fairly regularly, and you can put that reorder point calculation at the end item in 1.4.7 or 1.4.17, your item planning data. However, for lower level items, the demand is lumpy. So when you have a bill of material parent component relationship, the only demand that occurs is when you launch an order for the parent, and that makes the stock or the reorder point logic on a lower level item, a dependent demand item, it doesn't work very well. So we tend not to use reorder point on bombs. We only use reorder point at the top orders. So let's talk a little bit about safety stock. Safety stock is used to prevent a stock out. It's the amount of stock carried, and it depends on the variability of demand. Remember, we looked at that independent demand item. How often we order, what we call the desired service level, and the length of the lead time, and our ability to forecast and control lead times. And this is usually the planner and the buyer's responsibility. The formula is safety stock equals desired service level times MAD adjusted for lead time. I'll explain that in just a second. We carry safety stock in MRP systems at the very lowest levels of the bill of material and the very highest levels of the material. When you tend to carry safety stock at the mid levels, at the subassembly levels, that can very much skew the planning process of MRP, which we'll look at on July 18th. The measures of the variability of demand, if you look at a simple bell curve, here are the occurrences of demand across a normal average. And you can see that if you use a standard deviation, the square root of the differences between the actual and the forecast squared divided by the number of periods, you get the standard deviation. Normally, we use the simpler method of the mean absolute deviation, or the sum of the demand variations by the number of periods, and we can therefore assign a probability of occurrence of an actual demand falling within this bell curve. So 98% of the time, we can say that demand is projected to be 3 mean absolute deviations away from the average. The service level, how much we want to allow the system to have stockouts, increases with the service level. You see here we're going from 80 to 90. Here's our MAD value, inventory and carry cost, and you can see that the higher the service level, the greater the amount of safety stock necessary to carry to ensure that service level. So the higher the service level, the more inventory you're going to buy. The safety factor, the basic safety stock calculation assumes that the replenishment lead time is equal to the forecast interval. So if you're forecasting on a monthly basis and your lead time is 8 weeks, then you're going to want to adjust that mean absolute deviation by a factor that accounts for the variance between the forecast interval and the lead time interval. And this gives you a table of what those adjustment factors might mean or might be. And again, we don't have the time to get into the actual calculations, but basically you're going to modify your mean absolute deviation by that forecast period. So here's a simple example of a safety stock calculation. We've got a mean absolute deviation of 250 units. Our lead time is 8 weeks. We want 95% service factor, and our forecast interval is 4 weeks. So if we take the lead time by the forecast interval, you see we've got a 2 multiplier. We adjust the MAD, or the mean absolute deviation, by that multiplier. If we go back to the previous overhead, we can see 2 is equal to that 1.63. So we multiply the MAD times the 1.63, gets 408. 408 times the safety factor gives us a safety stock of 840. Now that's a statistical method of calculating safety stock as opposed to what we might call a heuristic or a seat of the pants or a thumbnail estimate of safety stock of 2 weeks of demand, or however you calculate it. This is actually a statistical method for doing that. So if we summarize safety stock, we can see that safety stock is a permanent investment. So if the management wants 99% service level, they're going to have to pay for that in inventory. The higher the service level, the more must be invested. And we've got to take into effect that lead time versus forecast interval variability. And the reorder frequency often calculates how often you're going to expose to that. And there's another calculation that you can use to look at that frequency of ordering. And at MRP, when we look at that on July 18th, we'll see that safety stock basically raises the projected quantity on hand to this value. So instead of a net zero availability, if you have a safety stock value, it takes it up to that safety stock as the zero availability. So the next question would be, how much do we order? Well, management, or us as planners, or the system, will want to maximize or minimize the sum of all costs involved. We want to keep those costs down, but yet maximize the customer service. So we as managers need to make some decision rules. The methods of deciding how much to order are basically lot for lot, the fixed order quantity, or what we call EOQ, period order quantity, and then we have some modifiers, min, max, and multiple quantities. If you look at the lot size, as we go back to our sawtooth curve, where we're depleting inventory and then we're replenishing inventory based on that order quantity. So in this case, the weekly demand is 100 units and the order quantity is 200. Average lot size would then be 100 units, because we're maintaining an average of 100 units. and the number of times that we're going to order would be 26 periods per year. Let's look at EOQ, or economic order quantity. EOQ assumes that demand is going to be relatively constant and known, so we know that that curve is going to be what we think it is. Items are produced and purchased in lots, and these costs, the preparation, inventory, carrying costs, lead times, are constant and known, and the replenishment costs are understood. So if we look at lot sizing, we're looking at what's called the order cost. So if you order a large number of items, the number of times you're going to order is less, and therefore the order cost is less. However, if you order those larger quantities, it's going to be around an inventory a longer time, so the carrying cost is going to be higher. And so if you take the carrying cost plus the order cost, you're going to come up with what's called the total cost. So if we graph that very simply by taking the order quantity and the carrying cost, you can see that we now have a curve equaling the total cost, and that EOQ is at the lowest point of that total cost curve. So if you look at this, you don't want to graph every part that you got. So we've got a couple of formulas that allow us to do this. We can calculate EOQ in terms of the dollar value of the order, or economic order quantity in terms of units. So here, those are both the least total or the least total cost. And this is the annual usage in units. This is the setup or fixed ordering cost in dollars. I is the carrying cost, and C is the unit cost. So that's how we would calculate the economic order quantity. And I think Denise has given you a handout in the webinar folder. I created this little spreadsheet that allows you to calculate what your EOQ is for a particular item based on demand, the unit cost, and the order cost, along with a variable carrying cost value. So that brings us to our 30 minutes of presentation. Denise, if you're ready, I will turn it back to you if there are any questions. A lot of information, but we'll see how that all applies to the actual calculation of MRP in July.
So if anybody does have any questions, go ahead and type them in. We will include any questions even after the webinar. Anything that we receive up until the session the replay is published, we will include those at that time. So just keep them coming. Shoot us an email, give us a call if you think of things after the session has ended. But for now, like I said, we'll just go ahead and move along and tell you what we have up next. As Don mentioned, he returns again next month for our July webinar, MRP, Best Practices for Best Results. We do have a number of registrants for that already, so registration is open. You can find registration links at the bottom of all of our communications, as well as on the website, our website as well. And I also wanted to mention, we continue to tap that knowledge base called Don Lindsey. And if you remember the fresh off the press articles I mentioned earlier, Don is authoring a few blog articles. So be sure to keep an eye out for your Encore email, because it will come from me, Denise at 32Soft, and I will include a link to any of the articles that are available at the time today's replay is published. We also have some fall conferences that we will again participate in, both the Midwest User Group and West Coast User Group conferences. So if you plan to attend, please plan to visit. We did get a question, so I'm going to flip back to Q&A real quick. Here's a question for you, Don. Very high level, great information. If we have questions about some of the information presented, can we contact Don? That's a great question. Absolutely. Do you want them coming directly to you, Don, or how do you want to handle it?
Just go ahead and send the email to 32Soft or Denise or Alex, and we'll get back with you as to your specifics. I had a couple of questions from the registration process, and we were able to help a couple of people with a pegging browse and a work order detail issue they were having. So yeah, if you've got any questions about MRP, the MRP D tables, master scheduling, forecasting, please just shoot me an email. Glad to help. In summary, all of these calculations of forecast, reorder point, EOQ, safety stock, those should be done on a monthly basis and recalculated on a monthly or period basis. If you're doing quarterly or weekly MRPs, it depends on your company. But to just put in a value and let it lay fallow for any period of time is not going to make your MRP system as responsive as you need it to actually keep up with the day-to-day changes. So discipline, consistency, and do it on a regular cycle.
Great. Great. Thanks very much. Okay, we typically close out with a final thought. So factors, orders, remember, never forecast what you can calculate. I want to thank Don Lindsey so much for joining us today, and I hope everybody found their time to have been well spent, and we really hope you'll join us again next month.